Jetpack Joyride is a staple in everyone's childhood. This was one of my favorite games growing up, so I'm going to try to remake it in 3D. The first thing I need is a character. To create a character, I need to look for a model. After searching through Sketchfab and finding nothing, I decided to make my own model using voxels. What is voxels, you might be thinking? Let me explain. This is a sprite. It's made up of these tiny squares called pixels. Voxels are these pixels, but in 3D, so they're basically just cubes. This is similar to what Minecraft uses for its builds. Anyways, I'm going to use these voxels to remake all of these sprites, starting with the player. This is probably the hardest model to remake, but I'm sure it'll be no problem with my extensive Minecraft experience. Alright, I'm finally done with this model. I think it looks alright, but I still have to animate it. Speaking of animations, there are 3 animations for this player. The first one's flying. This one's relatively simple, it's just this barrel that rotates. The second animation is running. This is a bit harder because I've got to tilt everything at 45 degrees. And the last animation is dying, which is just changing colors. And after finishing all these animations, it's time to bring them back into Unity and link them with some movement. In Jetpack Joyride, the player is always moving forward and can fly by tapping the screen. So the traditional WASD player controller I use won't work. But I can use it as a base, but I need to change some things. First, I need to ignore W and S inputs and just apply a speed that increases over time with this line. Also, since jumping is replaced with flying, instead of checking for key presses, we check for key holds and apply constant force up instead of just an impulse. To wrap up the player, I link the animation and add a first and third person camera you can switch between. With the player done, I can now move on to the enemies. In Jetpack Joyride, there are these 4 enemies. They're more like obstacles really. These 2 are pretty much the same, but one of them rotates, so I'll just get rid of it. So the first obstacle are these things called zappers that kill the player if it touches them. Now for a beginner in voxel art, making this in 3D is nearly impossible. Because, I mean, look at it. So instead, I'll just make the laser heads and let ShaderGraph and Unity's particle system deal with the rest. In the original game, these zappers are randomly scattered around the map at different lengths and orientations. So in my game, I'll add random generation for their length, position and orientation, and then just set the spawner to spawn them in at set intervals. And that's the zappers done. Now the second obstacle is a laser. This thing appears in 20-second intervals and pretty much just cuts out 2/3 of the screen. To make this, I'll model the laser heads from before and modify the shaders from the zappers. But for the actual functionality, I'll split the y-axis into 3 sections and add lasers to each of them. Now I'll have a script that randomly picks between 1, 2 or 3 and closes off that section of the laser. And after 5 seconds of firing, the lasers go away and then reappear after 15 to 20 seconds. And now all that's left is to fine tune these animations and stop zappers from spawning in when the laser is active. The final obstacle left is a missile. All this does is give the player a warning and then shoots towards the position you were when you got that warning. Now making the actual missile move forward is simple enough, but the big issue is that the 2D missile actually takes a lot of room and forces the player to move. But in 3D, it doesn't take up any room. Now if I increase the amount of missiles that spawn, they start to feel random and impossible to avoid. So instead, I fire rows of missiles instead of just one. But what's the point of enemies if they can't hurt you? So I added a collider to each of them and made it so that on collision, the player's death animation plays, along with making the jetpack fall off the player's back and disabling movement and lock rotation to get some funny results, along with a couple other things. Now the game's mechanics are done, but the player is still in this white box, which is not the setting for the original game. So it's time to make the levels. The original game follows this pattern. There'll be a facility area and then one of these 5 different areas, and then a facility area with a higher number and then a random area again, and this loops forever. For this video, I'll only be making the facility areas because it's much easier to make and I'm tired of randomizing things. And since the game is infinite, the levels are procedurally generated. So I made these 6 sections and assigned them to a number and then spawned in their prefabs with increments until I reached the highest value, where it just continues to spawn the last hallway. But wait, each of these sections has subsections, so it's time for more randomization. So I created 7 subsections, some big, some small, some with a door, some without. You get the idea. And then randomly generated them. I just repeat this for all the big sections and make sure to spawn in the introduction subsections before everything. Now all I need to do is add a back wall and some fog and a world destroyer to remove the previous sector once they've been walked past, for performance reasons. Now the game is nearly done, but it's missing two things: coins and NPCs. Coins are simple enough, so I model a coin, make it spin, and add a counter every time the player collides with it. But it needs one more thing: randomness. So I made preset positions for the coins and then randomly picked one of them to spawn in the level. And no, I'm not going to randomize their position. Now for the best part, the NPCs. These were by far the most fun part of the original game. Seeing these scientists walk forward only to see a sea of bullets and have no choice but to run to meet their eventual demise was very entertaining to me as a kid. So I made a model for the scientists and got it to walk forwards. But as the player gets in range of the first check, it gets alerted and turns around to run away. But since it's slower than the player, it eventually dies. Now to finish off the NPC, we had more randomness by spawning between 1 to 4 scientists at 4 random spawn points and then making them walk towards the player. And now with the NPCs done, that's about it for our game. And this is the final version. Now technically this is still not complete, it's still missing a lot of things like power-ups and tokens, so if you want to see that, tell me in the comments. And obviously I'm not going to publish this as I'm pretty much ripping off every mechanic from Halfbrick and I don't want to get sued. If you want to know more about Jetpack Joyride, the guy who made it has the channel and I'll link it in the description. Anyways, like if you like, dislike if you don't, and goodbye.